The Wyoming winter of '83 didn't just kill men, it swallowed them whole. Out in the blinding white, a freezing young Shoshone woman and 3 starving fillies were left for dead, but the snow didn't claim them. A solitary mountain man did, and hell followed right behind him. The Wind River Range in the dead of January was no place for the living. The wind did not merely blow, it shrieked, carrying jagged shards of ice that tore at exposed flesh and blinded the eyes. The temperature had plummeted 40 degrees in a matter of hours, a white death that caught even the most seasoned frontiersman off guard. Huddled beneath the meager shelter of a jagged limestone overhang, a 19-year-old Shoshone woman named Kaya fought a losing battle against the cold. Her buffalo robe was heavy with ice, and her breath plumed in weak, ragged gasps. Pressed tightly against her, sharing what little body heat they had left, were 3 yearling fillies. They were rib-thin, their winter coats matted with snow and frozen sweat. One was a deep blood bay, another a grollo with a striking dorsal stripe, and the third a scrappy red roan. They were not her horses, they were bait. Only 2 days prior, Kaya had been riding with her older brother Tosawi toward the trading post near South Pass City. They were driving a string of 6 prime Appaloosa geldings, horses bred by their father, meant to secure flour, heavy wool blankets, and repeating rifles for their camp. But they had been intercepted by Jeremiah Zeke Banyan. Banyan was a notoriously ruthless horse trader and whiskey runner, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, dead eyes. Banyan hadn't come to trade. He had come with 5 heavily armed roughnecks. They had ambushed Kaya and Tosawi in a narrow ravine. Tosawi fought bravely, but a bullet to the shoulder had knocked him from his mount. Banyan's men took the Appaloosas, but Banyan himself had a crueler twist in mind. Knowing a blizzard was rolling over the peaks, he left Kaya with 3 half-starved fillies he had been hauling, mocking her as he rode away. Let the mountain have the squaw in the scrubs, he had laughed, kicking his spur into his horse. Tosawi had managed to escape on foot to draw their fire, leaving Kaya hidden in the brush with the useless, freezing fillies. Now 48 hours later, the mountain was indeed claiming them. Kaya's hands, clad in thick deer-hide mittens, had lost all feeling. The roan filly pressed her muzzle at the Kaya's neck, a desperate plea for warmth that Kaya could no longer provide. The darkness at the edge of her vision was growing. It was a warm, inviting darkness. She closed her eyes, preparing to walk the spirit trail. Then the mountain spoke. It wasn't the wind. It was a heavy, rhythmic crunching. Thud, crunch, thud, crunch. Kaya forced her heavy eyelids open. Emerging from the swirling vortex of white was a monster. At least, that was what it looked like at first. As it drew closer, the monstrous shape resolved into a horse of gargantuan proportions, a massive Belgian draft cross, a beast of muscle and dark iron-gray hair, his wide hooves acting like snowshoes. Atop the beast sat a man. He was draped in thick, grisly fur, a Sharp's buffalo rifle resting across his saddle pommel. His face was obscured by a thick, frost-laden beard and the pull-down brim of a battered felt hat. This was Caleb Montgomery. At 38, Caleb had spent more of his life in the high country than in the company of men. He was a trapper, a former army scout, and a ghost to the settlements below. Caleb reined in his massive horse, Goliath. He had been tracking a wounded bull elk, needing the meat for the long winter, but the storm had washed away all signs. He had been heading back to his high timberline cabin when Goliath had suddenly halted, his ears pricked toward the limestone overhang. Caleb swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking waist-deep into the powder. He pushed through the drifts, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. A frozen lump of buffalo hide and 3 half-dead horses. He approached slowly. As his shadow fell over the overhang, the hide shifted. Suddenly, a blade flashed. Despite being on the brink of freezing to death, Kaya had drawn a skinning knife. Her hand shook violently, but her dark eyes were blazing with a defiant, terrified fire. She would not let another white man take her without a fight. Caleb didn't draw his sidearm. He didn't shout. He simply stopped, holding his large leather-gloved hands up, palms facing her. "Put it away, little bird." Caleb's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, surprisingly soft given his intimidating stature. He spoke the words in broken, heavily accented Shoshone, a remnant of his days scouting near Fort Washakie. "Your blood is too cold to fight, and I ain't here to spill it." Kaya blinked, her mind sluggishly processing his words. The fact that he spoke her tongue momentarily shattered her defenses. The knife wavered. Caleb moved with a speed that belied his size. He stepped forward, gently gripping her wrist and prying the knife from her frozen fingers. "I've got a cabin," Caleb said, switching to English, assuming she might understand. "2 miles up the ridge. You stay here, you die. These ponies die. You ride with me, you might just live." Kaya stared at him, her lips blue, unable to form words. She looked at the Fillies. They were her responsibility now. She gave a small, jerky nod. "All right then," Caleb muttered. He turned to Goliath, unhooking a heavy woolen blanket from the saddlebags. He wrapped it tightly around Kaya, lifting her effortlessly in his arms. She weighed practically nothing to him. He set her gently upon Goliath's broad back, right behind his saddle. Then he turned to the Fillies. They were hesitant, spooked by the giant draft horse and the strange man. Caleb reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a handful of crushed dried oats and molasses, a treat he kept for Goliath. He offered it to the roan. She sniffed it, then greedily licked his palm. "Come on, girls," Caleb coaxed gently. "Walk in Goliath's tracks. He'll break the snow." It was a brutal, agonizing 2-mile trek. The wind fought them for every inch. Caleb walked ahead of Goliath, using his massive body to help trudge a path through the chest-high drifts. Behind Goliath's, the 3 Fillies followed nose to tail, stepping precisely into the deep holes left by the draft horse. Kaya clung to the saddle horn, drifting in and out of consciousness, her head resting against Caleb's broad, fur-covered back whenever he remounted to cross a frozen creek bed. Caleb's cabin was a fortress built into the side of the mountain, shielded by a dense grove of ancient ponderosa pines. Attached to the back was a sturdy log lean-to, insulated with mud and pine boughs designed to keep Goliath warm. When they finally arrived, the sun had vanished entirely, leaving the mountain in pitch darkness. Caleb worked with practiced, frantic efficiency. He led the 3 Fillies and Goliath into the lean-to, throwing a heavy mound of wild mountain hay before them. He quickly draped dry blankets over the trembling Fillies. Then he carried Kaya inside the cabin. The interior was small, smelling of wood smoke, dried sage, and old leather. Caleb laid her on his bed, a thick mattress of pine needles covered in bear hides. He immediately set to work building up the fire in the stone hearth. Within minutes, the dry cedar and pine caught, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the room. But the warmth was an enemy to a frozen body if applied too quickly. Caleb knew the frontier medicine. He didn't put her directly next to the fire. Instead, he heated stones by the hearth and wrapped them in cloth, placing them at her feet and beneath her arms. He had to get her out of her frozen, wet clothes. He hesitated. He was a solitary man, respectful of boundaries, but the harsh laws of the frontier dictated survival above modesty. "I have to take these wet things off you," he said softly, unsure if she could hear him. "I mean no disrespect." With careful clinical movements, he removed her frozen outer layers, the heavy beaded tunic, the soaked leggings. He dressed her in one of his own oversized flannel shirts, a garment so large it swallowed her small frame entirely, reaching past her knees. He then buried her under 3 layers of heavy buffalo and wolf pelts, He brewed a strong tea of willow bark and yarrow, propping her head up to spoon the bitter liquid past her chattering teeth. For the next 2 days, the blizzard raged outside, trapping them in the small cabin. And for 2 days, Kaya burned. The severe chill gave way to a violent fever. She thrashed under the heavy hides, soaked in sweat, trapped in the delirium of her illness. Caleb barely slept. He bathed her forehead with cool snow water, forced broth down her throat, and listened to her fevered ramblings. In her delirium, she spoke in a mix of Shoshone and English. She cried out for her brother, Tusawi. She pleaded with her father, and repeatedly she cursed a name that made the blood freeze in Caleb's veins. Banyan, Zeke Banyan, she muttered, tossing her head from side to side. Thief, he took them. Left us to the ice. Caleb sat perfectly still by the fire, the wet cloth in his hand dripping onto the floorboards. Zeke Banyan. The name was a ghost from a past Caleb had tried to bury under years of mountain snow. 5 years ago, in a dusty border town in Colorado, a younger Caleb and his brother Thomas had crossed paths with Banyan. Thomas had caught Banyan cheating at a faro table and called him out. Banyan hadn't fought like a man. He had waited until Thomas walked out into the dark alley, shooting him in the back and fleeing into the night. Caleb had hunted Banyan for a year, but the man had vanished into the Dakota Badlands. And now the ghost had resurfaced in Wyoming, leaving this young woman to die. Caleb's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking in his cheek. He looked down at Kaya, her face flushed with fever, her dark hair plastered to her forehead. She wasn't just a stranger he had pulled from the snow anymore. She was a victim of the very devil Caleb owed a debt of blood to. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally died down. The oppressive roar of the storm was replaced by a deafening, pure silence. Caleb left Kaya sleeping. Her fever had finally broken in the night, and stepped outside. The world was blindingly bright, buried under 4 feet of pristine white. He shoveled a path to the lean-to check on the horses. Goliath nickered a greeting. The 3 fillies were huddled together, looking significantly better. The mountain hay and shelter had worked wonders. As Caleb ran a brush over the blood bay filly, knocking loose the dried mud and matted hair on her left shoulder, he noticed something strange. The hair grew in an unnatural, puckered pattern. Caleb frowned, pulling off his glove. He ran his calloused thumb over the skin beneath the heavy winter coat. It was a scar, a brand that had been deliberately burned over to obscure its original shape. Caleb grabbed a pair of shears from his tack box and carefully clipped away the winter hair around the shoulder. Beneath the jagged, messy blotch of a burn, the faint but unmistakable lines of a U and an S were visible. U.S. Cavalry. Caleb stepped back, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The twist hit him like a kick to the chest. Banyan hadn't just been hauling scrub horses to trade. These were stolen cavalry remounts. Banyan was stealing military horses, burning over the brands, and trying to pawn them off in the high country. And by ambushing Kaya and her brother, taking their prized Appaloosas, and leaving the Shoshone girl with the stolen government fillies, Banyan had set up the perfect frame job. If the army found Kaya frozen with these horses, they would assume the Native Americans were the horse thieves. "You clever, evil son of a bitch," Caleb whispered, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the valley below. The heavy wooden door of the cabin creaked open. Caleb turned to see Kaya leaning heavily against the doorframe. She was pale, weak, and practically drowning in Caleb's flannel shirt, but her eyes were clear. She looked at Caleb, then at the horses, and finally at the vast, snow-covered world around them. "You are not a ghost," she said, her voice raspy but steady. "No, ma'am," Caleb replied, walking slowly toward her. "I'm flesh and blood. Name's Caleb Montgomery. I am Kaya," she said, holding her head high despite her weakness. You saved my life. Seems we both have a mutual acquaintance who tried to end it, Caleb said, his voice lowering into a dangerous rumble. Zeke Banyan. Kaya's eyes widened in surprise. You know this snake? I know him, Caleb said, stepping up to the porch. And I know what he did to you. You left you with stolen army horses to take the fall. Kaya looked at the Fillies, the realization dawning on her. Her expression hardened, a fierce anger replacing the vulnerability of her illness. My brother, Tusawi, he is out there. Banyan took my father's horses. You must pay. Caleb looked at the young woman. He saw the fire in her eyes, a fire that not even a Wyoming blizzard could extinguish. He felt an unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a profound respect, and something deeper, something protective. He'll pay, Kaya, Caleb said, his hand resting instinctively on the handle of his Colt revolver. Soon as the pass clears, we're going hunting. For 10 agonizing days, the Wind River Range remained locked in a cage of ice. Inside the cabin, however, a slow and quiet thaw was taking place between the solitary mountain man and the Shoshone woman. As Kaya's strength returned, she refused to be a burden. She took over the care of the horses, her hands moving with an innate practiced grace over the fillies' coats. Caleb watched her from the cabin porch, silently smoking his pipe. He had seen many horsemen in his time, including the famed riders of the 5th Cavalry out of Fort McKinney, but Kaya possessed a rare, whispered language with the animals. Under her care, the blood bay, the grotho, and the scrappy red rowan began to fill out, their ribs disappearing beneath healthy muscle. A quiet, unspoken respect blossomed into something deeper. Caleb, the man who had spent 5 years speaking only to his draft horse and the wind, found himself looking forward to the evenings by the hearth. He shared stories of his brother Thomas and the betrayal that had driven him to the high timberline. In turn, Kaya spoke of her father, a respected elder in Chief Washaki's camp, and the painstaking generations of breeding that had produced their prized Appaloosas. There was no sudden theatrical romance. It was born in the passing of a hot cup of chicory coffee, the shared silence of a winter dawn, and the mutual understanding of a harsh world. When Caleb's massive, calloused hand accidentally brushed against Kaya's while repairing a torn saddle cinch, the jolt of electricity was palpable. She didn't pull away. She looked up at him, her dark eyes holding his gaze, reading the profound loneliness etched into his weathered face and offering a silent promise of solidarity. On the 11th morning, the Chinook winds arrived. The warm, dry gusts swept over the peaks, melting the top layers of snow and breaking the back of the blizzard. It was time to hunt. They rode out at daybreak. Caleb sat atop the mountainous Goliath, the heavy .590 Sharps rifle resting across his lap. Kaya rode the blood bay filly, guiding the responsive animal with nothing but a hackamore fashioned from braided rawhide. They descended into the valley, the world dripping and echoing with the sound of melting ice. Finding Banyan's trail was impossible after the storm, but Caleb knew the man's habits and Kaya knew the land. If he wants to move stolen cavalry remounts and 6 prime Appaloosas, he cannot go to the open railheads in Cheyenne, Kaya reasoned, her breath pluming in the crisp air. He must go south toward the Badlands, or east to the hidden canyons of the Sweetwater. Caleb nodded. Red Canyon. It's a blind ravine used by rustlers. It's a straight shot to the Colorado Territory from there. 2 days later, near the jagged, rust-colored limestone formations of Red Canyon, they found their first piece of luck. It came in the form of a dying fire and a man cursing into the empty expanse. It was a roughneck named Dutch Henry, one of Banyan's hired guns. He was huddled beneath a frozen cottonwood, nursing a leg that had been shattered by a horse's kick. Banyan, true to his venomous nature, had left him behind to die when he slowed the herd down. Caleb swung down from Goliath, his boots hitting the mud with a heavy thud. He approached the injured outlaw, drawing his Colt revolver with a terrifying, deliberate slowness. "Montgomery," Dutch Henry gasped, his face draining of whatever color the cold hadn't already stolen. He recognized the mountain man from the old days in Colorado. Everyone knew the ghost who had been hunting Banyan. "Where is he, Dutch?" Caleb's voice was a low, seismic rumble. "You're too late," Dutch spat, wincing in agony. "He's at the canyon mouth, meeting a buyer for Montana. But that ain't the worst of it, Montgomery. Banyan sent a rider to Fort Washakie before the storm hit. Told Captain Higgins that Chief Washakie's braves slaughtered a cavalry detail and stole their remounts. By tomorrow, the army will be riding into the Shoshone camp to burn it to the ground." Kaya let out a sharp intake of breath. Her father, her people, the frame job was already in motion. "And my brother?" Kaya demanded, stepping forward, her hand resting on the hilt of her skinning knife. "Tusawe, where is he?" Dutch coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Banyan's got him. The Indian tracked us, tried to steal the Opelousas back 2 nights ago. Banyan caught him, kept him alive to serve as a witness when the army arrives. He's gonna force your brother to confess to the killings, then hang him." The revelation struck Kaya like a physical blow, but she didn't break. She looked at Caleb. The quiet mountain man's eyes were no longer calm. They were hard, flat chips of blue ice. He had lost his brother to Zeke Banyan. He was not about to let Kaya lose hers. "Bind his leg," Caleb told Kaya, not looking away from the canyon. "Leave him enough water to survive. Then we ride." The mouth of Red Canyon was a natural fortress of sandstone, the rusted walls rising 200 feet into the air. The Sweetwater River, half frozen and sluggish, carved its way through the center. In the basin below, surrounded by a makeshift corral of fell lodgepole pines, were the 6 magnificent Opelousas. From their vantage point on a high ridge, Caleb and Kaya looked down into the camp. Banyan was there, pacing near a roaring fire, checking his gold pocket watch. 4 heavily armed men patrolled the perimeter. Tied to a wagon wheel, battered and bleeding, but unmistakably alive, was Tusawe. "The buyer isn't here yet," Caleb whispered, sliding the heavy Sharps rifle from its scabbard. He opened the breech, slipping a massive brass-cased cartridge into the chamber. "We have the element of surprise, but we are outgunned. I will take the high ground and create panic. You circle down through the river brush. Cut your brother loose, get the horses, and get out. I am not leaving you to fight them alone," Kaya said fiercely, her grip tightening on the reins of the bay filly. Caleb looked at her. In the harsh midday light, she was breathtakingly fierce. He reached out, his thick, leather-gloved fingers gently touching her cheek. "You get to Tusawe safe," he said softly. "I owe Banyan a debt. This is my ledger to clear." Kaya pressed her hand against his. "Do not let the darkness take you, Caleb. We have a life to live after this." With a final nod, she slipped off the ridge, melting into the thick, frost-covered willows lining the riverbank. Caleb waited until he saw the faint movement of the brush near the wagon. He took a slow, deep breath, settling the heavy iron sights of the buffalo rifle on the nearest guard. He exhaled and pulled the trigger. The roar of the 50-90 in the enclosed canyon was deafening, sounding like a cannon strike. The guard was thrown backward off his feet, as if struck by a runaway locomotive. Panic erupted in the camp. Banyan's men scrambled for cover, firing wildly at the ridge. Caleb worked the lever of the Sharps with mechanical precision. Boom! A second outlaw's rifle shattered in his hands. Boom! A chunk of sandstone exploded next to Banyan's head, showering him with lethal shrapnel. Down below, Kaya moved like a shadow. While the men were pinned down by Caleb's devastating artillery fire, she sprinted from the willows, a sharp flint knife in her hand. She reached the wagon and slashed the thick hemp ropes binding Tusawi. Her brother slumped into her arms, coughing. "Kaya," he rasped, disbelief in his eyes. "Can you ride?" she demanded. Tusawi looked at the Appaloosas, then back to his sister, a fierce, bloody grin spreading across his face. "Try and stop me." But the chaos of the gunfire had spooked the horses. The Appaloosas crashed against the makeshift corral, breaking the timber. As Kaya and Tusawi scrambled onto the nearest mounts, Banyan realized what was happening. Seeing his prize slipping away, the outlaw abandoned his men to Caleb's fire and sprinted toward the wagon, drawing his twin Colt peacemakers. "Nobody walks away from me," Banyan screamed, aiming squarely at Kaya's back. Up on the ridge, Caleb saw it. A sickening wave of déjà vu washed over him. The dark alley in Colorado, his brother turning to walk away, Banyan aiming at his back. Caleb's heart seized. He swung the heavy rifle, but the angle was wrong. He couldn't make the shot without hitting Kaya. He dropped the rifle, stood up in full view of the remaining outlaws, and roared, drawing his own revolver. The sound of his voice made Banyan hesitate for a fraction of a second. He turned, looking up at the ridge, recognizing the giant silhouette of Caleb Montgomery. In that singular moment of distraction, Kaya did not flee. She spun her horse around, raised the lever-action Winchester she had pulled from her brother's saddle, and fired. The bullet struck Banyan in the right shoulder, spinning him violently into the dirt. His guns flew from his hands. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader drop and realizing they were fighting a ghost on a ridge and a heavily armed Shoshone war party below, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Caleb scrambled down the steep embankment, sliding the last 30 feet into the basin. He strode toward Banyan, his boots kicking up dust. Banyan was writhing in the dirt, clutching his shattered shoulder. Caleb cocked the hammer of his Colt, aiming it directly at the outlaw's forehead. 5 years of rage, grief, and isolation narrowed into the barrel of that gun. "This is for Thomas," Caleb whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Caleb, no." Kaya's voice cut through the ringing in his ears. She slid from her horse and stepped between Caleb and the bleeding outlaw. She reached out, placing her hand gently over the cylinder of Caleb's revolver. "If you kill him here, in the dirt, you are no better than he is," Kaya said, her voice steady and grounded. "And if he dies, my people hang for the cavalry horses. He must live to confess. We need him alive." Caleb stared at her. His chest heaved as the adrenaline warred with logic. He looked down at Banyan, who was staring up at him with a mixture of terror and pathetic relief. Slowly, agonizingly, Caleb uncocked the hammer and holstered the weapon. The ghost of his brother could finally rest. Caleb had chosen the living over the dead. 4 days later, a battered and bound Zeke Banyan was thrown onto the wooden floorboards of the U.S. Marshal's office in Lander, Wyoming. Standing over him was Deputy U.S. Marshal Heck Thomas, a man renowned for his uncompromising brand of frontier justice. Caleb and Kaya delivered the stolen cavalry Fillies, exposing the brands hidden beneath the burns, and presented Dutch Henry's confession. Marshal Thomas immediately wired Fort Washakie, halting the cavalry's march and clearing Chief Washakie's people of all charges. The frame job was dismantled, and Banyan was sentenced to hang at the territorial prison. The winter eventually broke, giving way to a vibrant, explosive Wyoming spring. On the edge of the Wind River Reservation, where the plains met the foothills, a new cabin was being built. It was larger than the one on the timberline, with a sprawling corral stretching out back. Inside the corral, Goliath, the massive draft horse, stood contentedly beside a herd of prime Appaloosas. Trotting playfully, among them were a blood bay, a Grulloa, and a red rowan filly. Caleb Montgomery hammered the final nail into the porch railing. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked out over the valley. He was no longer a ghost haunting the snowy peaks. He turned as the cabin door opened. Kaya stepped out, the warm spring sun catching the rich darkness of her hair. She smiled at him, a smile that held the promise of 100 Wyoming summers. He had saved her from the ice, but she had brought him back to the world of the living. If this tale of frontier justice, survival in the bitter cold, and an unlikely romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share the story of Caleb and Kaya with your fellow history buffs and Western lovers, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life sagas from the untamed Wild West. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment.